Okay, we've started our 15 minutes here. Welcome home to Scotland, Lorna Gold, and welcome to our Justice and Peace Scotland's Day of Reflection on the Laudato Si document. You'll be giving your own reflection a little bit later about that document and about the things that concern you and concern us about caring for our common home. But I wanted to ask you a few questions about issues that you may not touch on in your presentation. I've got to say that I've read my fair share of articles, documents and books about what we're doing to our common home and for our common home. And those, to me, which hit home the hardest are written by women. I go right back, because I'm that old, to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, right up to today with Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, and of course your own book, which we're very, very proud to launch today, which is Climate Generation, Awakening Our Children's Future. And I wanted to, why do you think it is that women's voices are so powerful? Even young Greta there is giving it loudly. Why are our voices so powerful?
Well, not to put the men out, have to say that first. But it was very interesting yesterday in the media in Ireland. They said that 3/4 of the adults on the streets yesterday were women. And I'm absolutely convinced that it's to do with motherhood. And it's to do with the fact that as a mum, you're almost programmed to think what is coming for the next generation. And again, that's very controversial maybe to say in terms that it's a generalisation, but it's borne out in the facts. It's borne out in the fact that women have to think about multiple things all the time. And I think that we bring to this whole discussion an emotional intelligence about what this means for the next generation, and realising in my own case that climate change isn't an issue for the future. It's not something that's happening 10 or 50 years from now. It's happening now, and what we do now affects what comes next, and that women are prepared to actually step in the sense of to step out and to step in a very kind of, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that says we're going to get this done, and we're not, the stakes are so high, we're not going to take no for an answer.
I go back to some of the things that you've said in your own book. You spent 10 years travelling the world to achieve a doctorate in economic geography. You worked on poverty and inequality issues. You say in the book, in Climate Generation, that in the 1990s, young people, including young people with academic and professional backgrounds like your own, believed that governments had the situation under control. Now, I mentioned Greta Thunberg. She's just told Congress in the US, I know you're trying, but just not hard enough. Sorry. So I wondered if you would comment on the difference in approach from the 1990s to today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been youth calling this issue out all the way from the 1990s. When I was about 16, 17, there was a girl called Séverine Maillard, and she gave a speech at the UN conference on the Earth Summit in Rio. And she gave the same talk that Greta Thunberg gives now. You could have just replaced her with Greta Thunberg, and that was 1992. And that led to a movement. But the difference is, I think, that nowadays we have this amazing opportunity, and I think it's one of the potential things that gives me hope is that we have the capacity now to make something global almost instantaneously. So we can create a global movement within 1 year. Nobody remembers, or very few people remember Severin, but she was a Greta of her time. So, I mean, I think that this movement building of young people has always been there, and young people will always fight for the future. But now we have this ability to kind of make this happen in a really, really fast pace of time. The other thing I have to say, and I mean, this is more from the professional perspective, is that for the best part of the 90s and the 2000s, we tried to communicate climate change and poverty and injustice through a very academic kind of lens and through a very policy kind of lens. I was a policy worker for Trocaire for 20 years, led our policy team. And I think the difference now is really that we've realised that we need to connect with people on an emotional level, at a very deep level, at a spiritual level, because policies, and there's such a disconnect between the policy and what concerns people individually. And I think Greta and the rest of us who are really leading the climate strike movement are doing that through saying this is about the different generations and what is more of concern to everybody than what happens to their children, their grandchildren, their nephews, their nieces. And if you can tap into that sense of profound love that we all have for the next generation, it's an unstoppable force.
Talking of emotion, at the end of this book, you give the very, very moving words that you spoke in your closing address at the 2015 Dublin Climate March. And we're now 4 years down the line. Are you disappointed or encouraged by what's happened since that Dublin event?
I'd have to say a mix of both. I'm disappointed in what the little that governments have done. We're still massively off track, even with the Paris Agreement. What the Paris Agreement did 4 years ago was to put all the responsibility onto national governments to sort this out. So they said, come up with your best case, your best ambition. And the best ambition that governments can come up with is that we'll limit heating of the world between 2 and 3 degrees. Now, 2 and 3 degrees is not a future we want for our children, our grandchildren. And yet that's where we are. And if you look politically, the situation since Paris has got a lot worse. We have I don't need to name names, but we're in a very, very fractured, very contested space politically, very, very worrying times politically. So, I mean, on that side, things are really bad, and the time for change is very tight. We need to be making dramatic changes to policies in the next 2 years to enable us to have the kinds of reductions that we need, because you don't change an energy system overnight. You don't change transportations. These are heavy, difficult things to change. So we need to change them, but we need to do it very rapidly. So that's on the more pessimistic side. If you look then at what's happening on the positive, I mean, yes, the young people give me hope. It's a bit of a cliche to say that. The fact that young people are claiming their future gives me hope. But do you know what gives me more hope? Is seeing the parents and the grandparents and the unions and everybody else joining forces. Because the sad reality is that the young people who marched all over the world yesterday do not have the time and they don't have the power to make the changes that we need in time to prevent the breakdown of the climate. It needs everybody. And then the other person who gives me hope is Pope Francis and Laudato Si. And it has been it had a massive impact on my own life. And I think that it's been very slow to wake up the church to this enormous challenge, but also we have this treasure of Laudato Si. And it's very challenging to us all, but that gives me huge hope when I see the church. Gatherings like this give me hope.
Good. On the back of your book, Naomi Klein, who also writes about climate and she is very vocal about that, and this changes everything, but she suggests that the UN has to play its role more effectively and in bringing governments together to effect change. Now, I know that, like Greta, you don't just want us to tell you how inspiring you are, although you are. What would you like to emerge from this day of reflection? What do you want Justice and Peace Scotland and the Scottish Bishops' Conference to do?
I might leave that one for my talk.
Okay. Okay, that's fine, because our sands of time are kind of running out. So if we bring our interview to a close, what 3 things do you ask of us? What could we as individuals, apart from buying Climate Generation Awakening to our children's future, what 3 things would make a real difference in caring for our common home?
Wow. The first, I mean, as individuals, I think that the fact that you're here means you're already awake to this issue. In Climate Generation, I talk about 3 different levels of change, because the thing is, we need to change everything, everywhere, all at once, which is a huge ask. But we can do 3 things. One thing is to really fall in love with nature again. It seems like a fairly kind of, like, I don't know, it seems airy-fairy in some ways to say fall in love with nature. But Pope Francis opens Laudato Si saying, the fact that St. Francis didn't look at nature as a thing, but as part of a family of creation, is at the heart of everything. It's at the absolute heart of our problems. So spreading that message, falling in love with nature again, being outdoors as much as you can, is the first thing, especially with children and grandchildren, and sharing that love of nature. The second thing I'd say is to pick at least one lifestyle change that you'll make after today as an individual. I can't tell you what that needs to be. What you can do is go online and check your carbon footprint. And I can say if it's anything like mine, you won't like what you see. You really won't like it because it involves things that we enjoy doing. But we have to face the fact that those things cost us carbon emissions, cost the earth. So look and see what you can do. And the third thing I'd say on an individual level is to talk about it. I mean, obviously it's now there in the ether now with the young people and the climate strikes. Bring this into your communities. Talk about it with the book. That's why I wrote the book, was to have a book that's really easy to read, hopefully, and gives hope and gives action, but written as a story. It's not a technical thing. So when I hear that it's being read in book clubs, that there's a bunch of mums sitting reading this book and talking about climate action in their local book club, it gives me so much hope. And of course, if I can add one final one, it's all the big changes we need won't happen without politics. And I was here at the end of your morning session. Acting collectively and for political changes is indispensable. I describe it as like if you do all the other things for the sake of the next generation, but you don't do the politics, it's like when your kid's bullied at school and you'll send them in and tell them to be brave, and we'll make sure you don't meet that kid in the playground, but you don't go in to talk to the headmaster or the headmistress. We need to do the talking and talk to the people who have the power, as well as doing all the things ourselves. So my talk is kind of related to the book, but I was asked specifically to talk about the role, what we've done in Ireland in relation to Laudato Si and the Irish Church, because As well as writing my book, I work in Trocaire, which is the Irish equivalent of Skiaf, and I lead a project called Living Laudato Si. So we've been working for 2 years to bring Laudato Si to life in the Irish Bishops' Conference. Now, I can say that even though this might sound like we've done all this wonderful stuff, we always feel like we're just at the beginning. And so don't be put off if it seems like we've got it all sorted. We absolutely haven't. So I think that some of these questions might have been answered in the morning when you were talking about faith-based investments in fossil fuels. But I'm just going to go over some of them because one of the key projects that we've had in Trocaire has been working with church organisations to look at ethical investments in the context of climate change and planetary breakdown. So one of the campaigns that we very quickly kind of started to look at was the global fossil fuel divestment campaign. And I think so I'm going to talk briefly about why divest, and the second one is about what we've done in Ireland. When it comes to ethics, the big issue that we face today is one of intergenerational justice. And I think that Pope Francis puts this very, very succinctly in Laudato Si when he says that what kind of world do we want to leave to those who can come after us, to children who are now growing up. And you know as well as me from what you've heard and what you'll hear after me is that the effects of climate change and destruction of the environment are felt first and foremost by those who are on the front lines, and that's those who live in the developing world. A temperature rise of 1.1 degrees Celsius, which has happened already, is already wreaking havoc with the people that Trocaire and Skiaf work for. And in fact, Pope Francis says that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis calls us into a whole different space theologically and also in terms of how we approach the ethics of our investments and all of our activities. And to me, this theology is summed up in one sentence of Laudato Si, where he says that even the fleeting life of the least of beings is the object of God's love. And in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with affection. It's a completely different lens for us to look at the earth and look at all the beings that we share this planet with. We're not talking now just about the human family when we come to talking about justice and peace. We're talking about a much greater family of creation and the whole cosmos. So where does that leave us in terms of the economics of climate breakdown? Well, we know that the cause of our current situation is the economic system that we have. In terms of our endeavours to better ourselves and to increase our own level of wealth and consumption, we have pretty much also that the rise of our climate emissions has gone completely hand in hand with that. There's very few countries in the world that have managed to better themselves without the destruction of the environment and without a heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So when we look at that from a kind of the perspective of what is needed now, we can say that we need to build a whole new economic model based on our ability not only to reduce our emissions, but we need to drastically reduce our emissions, but we also need to be enhancing our capacity, a pro-environment economy, not just one that reduces damage, but also benefits the planet. Pope Francis has thrown down the challenge, saying we need radical, urgent, systemic change that builds commitment from the grassroots and the grass tops. So it's not, it has to happen here or there, it has to happen everywhere. And we need to overcome the apathy and the ignorance about the scale and the urgency of the crisis. And divesting investments from the fossil fuel industry is one way in which we can do that. Pope Francis is very clear on that, on the whole need for a new energy system, but he also is very clear on the fact that this is system-wide. Our industrial system is not designed to, at the end of its cycle of production and consumption, to develop the capacity to absorb and reuse all its waste and byproducts. We know that it's systemic in terms of every single thing that we produce has a carbon footprint. Everything that we produce. So our entire economic system, which thrives on growth, is designed to increase our emissions. So how do we, in terms of where we're at, we know that the climate policies are still completely inadequate, as I said before. 4 years on from the Paris Agreement, we are still looking at rising emissions. If you look at this emissions trajectory curve, you can see that the predictions were that we would be on a glide path downwards and that our emissions would be reducing by now. But emissions are still increasing. They're still increasing, meaning that this curve at the end to bring us down is far steeper now than it was when the Paris Agreement was signed. So urgent action it places the emphasis, the fact that governments are not standing up and making the changes, it puts the role of non-state actors front and centre, because the governments we have are actually failing us and failing the next generation. So we need to look for other ways to make change happen urgently. And we know that corporates and businesses are perfectly capable, and governments are perfectly capable to make those changes if they decide there's a financial imperative to do so, and also if public pressure is on them to do so. This is perhaps, for me, one of the most important slides that all of us need to be aware of in this room. Particularly if we're interested in making the case for divestment from fossil fuels and realigning our investments to low carbon investments. And this graph was made by Carbon Tracker in 2011, a leading think tank organisation based in the City of London. What it shows here is the reserves of oil that are on the oil majors. So that's the outer limit there. And the inner circle there is the actual share of that remaining fossil fuel budget that the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, can use if we are to stay within a 2-degree rise in global warming. What that means is that the fossil fuel companies, the stocks and shares, so from a financial point of view, the stocks and shares are vastly overpriced if humanity intends keeping the climate safe and also intends protecting our children from the worst of climate change. And bear in mind, this is based on 2-degree warming. The people who are living in the developing world today have experienced 1-degree warming. The people in the Bahamas have experienced that in all the tropical rainforests. So if you actually look at what's the level of carbon budget that corporations have left to burn, it's even smaller circle than that. So we need to catalyse a rapid energy transition to renewables. So coming to the question of investments, it is really about a consistent ethic, and it's about leading by example. I authored this document called Ethical Investments in an Era of Climate Change for Trocaire with the Global Catholic Climate Movement. And I think we have to take this in the line that we would treat any other issue of concern, any life issue. The church does not invest, most faith-based organisations would not consider investing in any companies engaged in abortion, engaged in slavery. So why should we be investing in companies that are fueling the destruction of the planet? And in investing in the infrastructure that would facilitate the further destruction? You might ask, where do you draw the line? And that's the hard thing. And yet, we cannot be investing as a church in projects that cause untold ecological damage. There's also the question that many of those same companies have failed to disclose their analysis of climate impact, so they're not fair or trusted partners in this, and I think it comes to the question of engagement with the companies. If the company, and there are good and bad and all of that, as the Bishop said, there are good companies and bad in the sense of disclosure, but their core business hasn't changed. And the disproportionate impact of the companies, the bought political influence, which has caused deadly delays in responding to climate change. So now to the positive story. Trocaire became the first Irish institution to divest from fossil fuels in 2015. And we embarked on a massive campaign at a societal level to divest public institutions. We worked on the political level, and we managed within 2 years to change the law so that the Irish government divested from fossil fuels. We supported the universities to divest. And then we came on to talking about how do we get our own church to divest from fossil fuels. And I think it's fair to say that we've done it quite well so far as an organisation. And I want to share a couple of points about that, about the journey. We're trying to overcome centuries of anti-earth theology, and I think we understood this quite well at the start of our journey. I went in 2016 and asked the bishops, would they divest from fossil fuels? And they said, what? What is that about? Actually, I think they thought I was talking about divestment from the education sector at that time, because we were involved in the whole kind of question of education. Divestment meant nothing. So we started to kind of take things back a bit and say we need to address this as a holistic thing with the church in Ireland. We need something akin to a synod, something that brings everybody like us here together to say, what do we need, how do we need our church to be in the 21st century? Because then how we use our finances becomes part of that. So what we did in Ireland was to set up a working group under the Bishops' Conference. And we used that to become a creative space where we got the best people in the country on these issues to come together and to say, how can we change what we're doing? How can the church become a leader on climate action and integral ecology? And we realised that one of the things we really needed to do was to build the confidence and the understanding of the bishops and all the bishops' conference and all the other people on the theology of it, but also on the practicalities. And so we started to offer in-service trainings to the Bishops' Conference. So this is just to give you an idea of who's on our group. We've Ireland's leading climatologist, we've got a number of leading theologians, we've got people in the communications sector, we've got Trocaire, Eco-Congregation Ireland, and many different people who all come together to look at how do we bring Laudato Si out into the church. And when we started to do that, things started to change. We started to propose, because we were part of the Bishops' Conference, a list of proposals that we could bring to the bishops for consideration. I should say one of the most important things that we did as a group was we brought the entire Bishops' Conference together for a retreat on Laudato Si. It was a wonderful day where the bishops, all in Ireland, there's around 30 bishops, all came and spent a whole day immersed in Laudato Si. And I don't think I'm giving any confidences away by saying that several of them came up to me and said afterwards, do you know what, it had passed me by. They were so focused on other things that this whole encyclical had risked, I guess Pope Francis is very prolific. So what we did then was to propose certain measures in line with Laudato Si that the bishops might take. And these included the season of creation, which then has become an annual thing in the church in Ireland, divestment from fossil fuels, adult faith development programmes, the school curriculum, and then the Laudato Si dimension when the Pope came to Ireland last year. In terms of divestment itself, the bishops, as you'll see at the end here, made their decision to divest from fossil fuels. And it required a bit of persistence, as I said. We failed twice to get the bishops to engage in this conversation. I don't think they understood. But the turning point was when they had the time on that day of retreat to meet a climatologist and to talk face to face in a very, let's say, safe space with the climatologist. And then they understood what we were talking about and the importance of taking that step. And we built a relationship with the bishop's advisors because they had heard from their advisors, their financial advisors, that this was too difficult to do. They couldn't do it, and that's a very common response. But when we sat down with the financial advisors and the bishop said, no, this is something we want to do, it was interesting because the advisors then came back with quite good proposals, and it was because they knew that there were other people potentially. The market was starting to work in Ireland because the divestment question had come up so much. And we worked then with the finance committee of the bishops, who were, it was actually in the end quite simple. They accepted the ethics, they accepted the science, they accepted the rationale, and they accepted that there was no reason to continue with those investments. So then the Irish Bishops' Conference and the Church of Ireland and 10 other religious orders within the past 2 years have made their divestment commitments. And even in the past 3 weeks, we're now working with the diocese, and 3 Irish dioceses have come forward to divest. And we're going to keep going, because we feel that Ireland could be a leading light, because we're the first country to divest our state from fossil fuels, our state investment fund, and that the Church in Ireland really sees this now as something that we can do to really align our mission with climate justice. So I want to leave you with the announcement when Bishop William Crean, who's the chair of Trocaire, made an announcement about the decision of the bishops to divest from fossil fuels on the eve of Pope Francis' visit to a packed Christchurch Cathedral, full of young people and full of people, I would say, you'll see from the response, it was really such an important occasion for the church in terms of being part of the climate movement and stepping up. Thank you.